Welcome back, everyone. Today on the podcast, we are joined with Macer Gifford. He is a human rights activist and a veteran of the war against ISIS. He's also the author of a book, Fighting Evil, The Ordinary Man Who Went to War Against ISIS. Currently, he is serving with the Ukrainian military. Macer, thank you so much for joining the channel. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's absolutely great to be on the show, and it's great to be back in the UK after so many months in Ukraine.
Is there anything else you want to add to your bio? Anything else you want the audience to know about yourself up front?
No, not really. I think I've always seen myself as a volunteer, as someone who goes abroad as a humanist, as a humanitarian, to get in the past to get involved in other people's conflicts, as it were. My time in Syria was obviously something that was life-changing, and I know we'll go into this. But before that, I spent time in Zimbabwe working for the MDC against Mugabe's ZANU-PF. I've worked in the Congo, I've worked in Ethiopia, so I really consider myself a human rights activist above everything else, basically.
So let's go back in time to February of 2022. Can you explain to the audience where you were and what you were doing and how you ended up volunteering with the Ukrainian forces?
Mhm. So, if we go right back to the beginning, if you go right back to the beginning, I can remember being at home at my desk, working on a few different projects. I'd started my own business, selling items and things online. I was busying myself with my second book, and I was watching in horror at the unfolding crisis in Ukraine. The Americans and Brits were quite clear that there was going to be an invasion. And I can remember going to a party one evening with a load of mates, and they sort of said to me, after all that you've done in Syria, and after all you've done obviously in the many other places you've been to and supported and got involved in, is there anything that you would want to do in Ukraine? And I can remember saying at the time, thinking, I don't know if there's anything I can do in Ukraine. I know that a lot of my friends, people like, I know, Aidan Aslin, a former volunteer from Syria, he'd gone out and joined the Ukrainian army way back in 2018. Short of doing that, what else could I do except for be like everyone else and watching horror? And then it became a sort of, after the party and the days following, it started to nag on my mind that maybe I should go out there before the war started, in the weeks prior to the war beginning, in early Feb, go out, write a few articles, meet people on the ground, perhaps meet up with Aidan, meet up with a few friends of mine, and perhaps get a few projects going. One of the projects that I did in Syria, for example, was I set up a group that taught TCCC. So we provided IFAK kits, individual first aid kits, to the Kurdish YPG and the wider SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. And by giving this medical support before some of the most bloody and terrible battles of the Syrian war, i.e. Manbij and Raqqa, it had a real impact. It genuinely helped. And I thought that maybe if I went to Ukraine before Russia invaded, I could do something similar. Anyway, I did go. I went 2 weeks prior to the war breaking out. I met some amazing people. I got to see Ukraine before the war, and I was profoundly moved. I can remember walking. If I'm honest, there was a disconnect between what the West was saying, what America and Britain were saying about the impending Russian invasion, and with what people on the ground were saying. People genuinely, it didn't feel like they truly believed a war was coming. And the Christmas decorations in Kyiv were still up in February. And I can remember walking the streets and looking through shop windows, looking through restaurant windows and seeing happy families eating and talking together. And it moved me almost to tears, because I can remember thinking to myself, like, God, these people don't know what's coming. Something dreadful is coming. I've seen in my time in Syria and Iraq and other places, entire cities devastated by war, and it would be horrendous if this were to happen here. And then as the weeks went on, and just prior, the day before, 2 days before the war actually did break out, I can remember thinking to myself, maybe starting to doubt myself. Maybe a war wasn't coming. Maybe this was all talk and bluster. But yeah, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, I was woken to the sound of bombs one day, and the invasion did start, obviously, and all my plans that I'd had for Ukraine just completely evaporated, because the Russian advance into Ukraine was sudden, and it was swift, and I believe Hostomel Airport, the airport north of Kiev, that was attacked on the first day. That meant that Russian troops were just sort of 15 kilometers from the center of Kiev. So everyone was quite blown away by the speed of the advance. And my plan, which I'd been doing for the previous week, was that I was dealing directly with the sort of territorial army, the reserve army of Kiev, and I was putting together a series of T-CCC videos that people could share with their phones and stuff like that. And we'd rented a big studio space, and we had all the medical supplies together, and it was all we were all due to shoot it the day of the invasion. We were due to shoot our first video, and then obviously the attack happened, and before long they were trying to mobilize, and there was nothing I could do. So I decided to return home. And to cut a long story short, what led me to joining the army, which I'll tell you more about in a second, but when I went back to Ukraine, I came back with a friend of mine from Syria who helped me set up that medical outfit with the Kurds, and we brought with us something like $150,000 worth of medical supplies, like a vast amount of IFAK kits. And for the next 3 months, that's all we did. We drove around Ukraine. I bought a car. I maxed out one of my cards. I was utterly broke after a few months, but I bought a brand new car, stuffed it full of medical supplies, drove across Europe, and as I said, began training people in T-CCC, which was my first introduction to the Ukrainian cause in crisis.
So what units did you end up joining?
So, as I said, I trained people for several months. In June, I went back for a break to see my family. And I heard of a group of international volunteers in the south calling themselves the Dark Angels. A number of them were people that I had met or knew of from Syria. So, and I saw videos of them. One video I saw of them hitting with a javelin a Russian tank and blowing it up. And because I knew these guys and I knew what they were doing, and I was speaking to them privately, I just thought to myself, do you know what? I can't just go around training people. I don't want to just raise funds to buy medical supplies. I genuinely want to get involved in this conflict in a more real and passionate way. I just wanted to experience exactly what the Ukrainians were going through. I wanted to stand in solidarity with them, and there's no greater act of solidarity than actually sticking on the uniform and saying, okay, I'm going to go with you guys. So I joined them at the wrong time, so I was in Ukraine again by July, and the guys were quite clear with me. They were like, well, we've been operating for a few months, we've been operating without permission, without contracts, we haven't gone through anyone, we're just dealing directly with several battalions, and this is not working anymore because they're changing the rules where it's much harder for people to get to the front line if they don't have contracts. We don't want to go through the Legion, they said, and I'd heard horror stories as well. They had heard horror stories. So they said, we need to sign directly with the Ukrainian military unit. But to do that involved a huge amount of paperwork. It wasn't easy for us as foreigners. We really struggled for a month. I even went back home to go to my little brother's wedding. But thankfully, by the time I got back in September, all the guys had moved from Dark Angels, most of the guys, and they set up a new group. They're calling themselves ICE, or the International Cossacks. And I joined them, and because of the work of a guy called Damian Rodriguez, who's an American citizen, a guy who I knew from Syria, someone who had been volunteering in Ukraine since 2018. He had a way-in with a battalion called the 131, Separate Reconnaissance Battalion, a regiment based down in the south. And because of that personal connection, we were able to get our contracts directly with them. And we did our first mission end of September. We were on the first mission by the 1st of October, basically.
I think that's when I found you on Twitter. You started posting these 2-minute videos last fall, probably close to September, and that's when I subscribed, and I've watched every one of your videos since then. I greatly appreciate them. In your own words, can you describe what does this war in Ukraine mean to you? What do you believe is at stake?
I think that the stakes here are the stakes in the war are absolutely enormous. I think at the end of the day, Ukraine is a sovereign country on the edge of Europe. It's been brutally invaded by the Russian Federation because it wishes to colonize them. It has its own twisted and perverse version of history, which erases the Ukrainian identity and culture that removes all sovereignty from the country and basically, as I said, just wants to colonize it. Much worse than that, or the global implications from this conflict go even further. We are in difficult and dangerous times, I think. After years of the so-called war on terror, and with the rise of countries like China, and with Russia increasingly throwing its weight around the world, I think the West is suffering a little bit from war fatigue. I think it's having a bit of an identity crisis within the West itself. And I genuinely worry about the future. And Russia and other countries are talking about a multipolar world where America is no longer the sole superpower, but instead we have regional powers. What effectively Russia and China are doing there is they're sort of saying we need to balkanize the world and we need to create regional powers. But that's exactly the conditions that the world was in prior to World War One. Russia's argument is that if we had regional powers, big nuclear armed regional powers, then they would never go to war. But again, that's the sort of same backward thinking of the world prior to World War One, whereby the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire and the British Empire and all the rest of it, they all started allying themselves with each other, thinking that it would be a no-win situation to go to war. And what Russia is doing is basically straight out of that playbook, i.e. them allying themselves with China, trying to balkanize the world, trying to erode American power, and trying to drive a wedge between the democracies of the world. And the trouble is, as I said, because of the war fatigue and because of our crisis of identity and culture in the West, I think they're very, very successful at that. I think they're doing a pretty good job. So, yeah, the implications of this war are vast. Vast in the sense that for Ukraine, it's everything to them. It's a war of annihilation. The Ukrainian state will not exist if Russia wins in Ukraine. For the world, it makes a much more unstable world, a world which is more violent, more chaotic, and more prone to conflict and warfare. So if we can stop them here, if we can say no, we have made, America and Britain and the West generally has made terrible mistakes in the past, but we do believe in democracy, secular values, progressive values, and we believe in Ukraine, we believe in the right for autonomy for nations. If we support Ukraine and make a stand here, humiliate Russia, reminds China of its limitations and the strength of the West, then it may be difficult now, and it may involve warfare, it may involve supplying Ukraine with weapons, but the long-term sort of health and prosperity of the West relies on supporting them now, basically.
I strongly agree, and I think the international actor that everybody is watching is China. And starting in 2003, China and Russia started doing these joint military exercises. Famously, the Beijing Olympics, right before the invasion, they announced they had this unlimited friendship going forward. Putin went to Beijing to meet with Xi. And really, China's not done much to help Russia. They're still doing business, they're not participating in sanctions, but militarily, as far as lethal force, China's doing nothing to help Russia. What do you think, just speculation, but what do you think Putin's reaction to all this is? Do you think he was expecting more active support from the Chinese?
Well, if I'm honest, I think Putin was expecting this war to be over by now. I
Yeah.
don't think he thought that he needed help from anybody. He thought he could take Kyiv in a few days. He, just like all dictators, and increasingly because of COVID and just his own personality, he was incredibly isolated. He has gone from over the last 10 years quite a rational, cold and calculated figure to someone, and personality, I should say, to someone who's a little bit more paranoid, a little bit more egotistical, although he was terribly egotistical, obviously, before as well, and a little bit, his grip on reality has basically slipped. And as I said, he does not believe Ukraine is a sovereign state. He doesn't believe, he has his own twisted and perverse version of history that cancels out Ukrainian identity. And he genuinely believed that this false and fake state of Ukraine would fold under the weight and power of the Russian Federation, which then turned out to be a clownish overreach, which has not only cost more than 100,000, 150,000 lives of his own soldiers, but has devastated his country and isolated him diplomatically, and actually ruined the long-term future of millions of Russians who are now trapped in Russia now, in Putin's Russia. So I think he has turned to, I think he was turning to China anyway. He had a long-term friendship with China, but this has really it's gone into overdrive now, as he has found Russian companies completely cut off from Western finance, oil and gas cut off from Western technology, and the financing for exploring for mineral resources and all the rest of it will no longer be coming from the West. He has to find investment from somewhere, and he sees China as the answer to his prayers. But what really that does is it means that he is completely making Russia subservient to China, it's China is happy to butter Russia up by talking about this enduring the special friendship, or whatever they're describing it as. But China, as you again rightly say, will always work in China's interest. China doesn't have a personal connection to Russia. It doesn't. What it really cares about is its own survival and its long-term economic and military benefits. So they can get a lot from Russia, and Russia can get a little bit from them. But as you say, the military support that Russia really needs right now from China isn't coming. But that's not because China is a good country and doesn't want to see more conflict in Ukraine and all the rest of it. That's primarily because China doesn't want to receive any sanctions. It doesn't want to further divide itself from the Western world, and it doesn't want also to drive the Western world even closer together than they already have from Russia. So I think they're playing a very balancing game, and they're also probably not 100% convinced that even if they did supply Russia with all the weaponry that they needed, that they'll actually win anyway, that will make a difference on the battlefield. So again, China's playing it cool, but the future, the sort of long-term prognosis for Russia is not a good one as far as I'm concerned.
The analogy I like to share with people concerning the Russian economy is it's only slightly larger than Spain. Yes, Russia had tremendous stockpiles of old Soviet equipment and weapons, but as far as their industrial capacity, their economic capacity to wage warfare, on paper, it's only slightly larger than Spain. So to expect them to compete with or go to war with the entire NATO and Western alliance, I've been arguing on my YouTube channel since day one, no, the math doesn't add up. Russia cannot survive or endure this for multiple years. So it's interesting. We're seeing these reports every day online that I just saw something this morning from the Moscow Times saying that on Kremlin State TV, they're already giving talking points to their broadcasters, preparing them for failure, preparing them that when Ukraine launches the counteroffensive, Russia might have to give up some territory and fall back to Crimea or whatever. And the narrative is that, well, Russia's fighting all of NATO. So, of course, this is going to be difficult, and this war is going to take years, and the Russian people are going to have to continuously sacrifice for the state and for the good of Mother Russia. It's not going to go well. But let me ask you... Let me ask
Well, I was
you.
only going to.
Go ahead.
Sorry, could I just? I was going to throw something in there because at the end of the day, the truth is something that Russia sees as something that can bend to its own will. So Russia has already will shift the goalposts. Continuously, as they already have. So initially, they obviously wanted to take Kyiv. They failed. They lost. They had to withdraw within a month. They then actually said, "Actually, no, that was a big fate. Like we didn't mean to do that at all. We actually our biggest plan was in the south, and actually, it was a huge success." And yeah, so that's all they're going to do. So even if they were to lose, because all of the media is controlled by Vladimir Putin, he just needs anything to sell to his people. And I think even if he lost, even if we went back to the pre-war borders, he will still describe that as a success. And one of the conditions that I think the Ukrainians should put into any, let's say, future peace deal, and I'm sure we'll get into this later in the program, but is to literally say something meaningless like, "Oh, we promise that neo-Nazis will not take control of the government," or neo-Nazis will not allowed to be president, or something. So they'll make some sort of meaningless concession that Russia will make a huge deal out of to its own people, and which is fantastic, because what the Russians will effectively do to their own people if the war did go back to the pre-war borders is they'll say, okay, well, we fought a war. Yes, 150,000 people died. Yes, we didn't take any extra territory, but we've got the Ukrainians to admit that they did have Nazis in the state and that they're not going to allow them to run anymore. So we've denazified Ukraine. We've also been able to secure, let's say, Crimea or parts of the Donetsk Republic that they've claimed. Let's say if they were given that in a future negotiation. So, and if that's officially recognised by the West or recognised by Ukraine, even though that was offered to them in the past in previous negotiations, they would still sell that as a success. They'll say, "Oh, great! Well, we secured the future of Crimea, let's say, or whatever, or we've allowed." They've admitted that Russians didn't have any rights, and then that there will be Russian peacekeepers or whatever involved in the next election in Ukraine, making sure that Russians don't get persecuted. Whatever. So whatever the future holds, Russia will spin its own narrative, even if if what we see is a complete and utter embarrassing failure, they can find something good out of it. That's just the way they are.
I do agree that there probably will be rhetoric included in any kind of settlements in order for Russia to get the propaganda machine going. But I personally think at this point, there's no scenario in which Ukraine will accept concessions of any of their territory. The Russian military 100% is going to have to leave Crimea completely demilitarized. They're going to have to leave the Donbass region. You know, if they want to take every person who identifies as Russian with them back to their country, they can do that. But they're not getting an inch of territory. I just don't see any scenario in which Zelensky at this point would agree to that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you, from your experience on the ground in Ukraine, what is the morale like of Ukrainian forces and in general the Ukrainian people?
Well, morale is very, very good. I mean, so I joined the 131, the Separate Reconnaissance Battalion. We operated primarily in the south, in and around Kherson before its liberation, and then after that we've operated in the Kherson region. The guys that I work with are incredibly professional. It's not a territorial battalion. It's not a battalion that's got many, or if any, conscripts. They're all volunteers. It's an existing regiment of the Ukrainian army. It's many of the people there have been trained by Western soldiers, and many of the weapons that they use, or most of the weapons they use, everything from the grots being the standard assault rifle to the NLAWs and the javelins that we use, are all Western supplied. And because of that, our battalion in particular is incredibly confident and incredibly meticulous in everything that it does. It's one of the best sort of battalions I've ever worked with, basically. Some of the guys there are literally brilliant. Some of the soldiers in my battalion that I've gone on the front line with are literally heroes of Ukraine. They've already won substantial battle honours in the years prior to this conflict, and learning from them and fighting alongside them has been absolutely mind-blowingly amazing. So yeah, the morale of them is very good. Of the Ukrainian people, it's very high. But I think the best way to describe it is defiant more than anything else. The defiance of the Ukrainian people, the belligerence, the sort of the fighting spirit of them is so incredibly strong. It's so strong that when you're in Ukraine, it's very hard not to feel it. It vibrates in the air. It's in the water. And it's in the soil, so it's it's everywhere, and it's encouraging.
Have you interacted with captured Russian soldiers? I want to get your impression of what they're like and what their morale might be like.
I have to say we haven't actually captured any Russians. My battalion kills Russians in a number of different ways. So my battalion is a reconnaissance battalion. So they utilize drones to call in artillery strikes. We also actually push patrols out that have actually got in contact with the Russians and got into firefights with them. We're not just an infantry battalion. Basically, we have a number of different roles within the battalion, from snipers to sappers to everything. So as I said, there's many ways that we've been able to degrade and destroy the Russian forces opposite us. That hasn't meant that we haven't taken any prisoners at all in the last. And that's not. That's actually not a statement. I probably shouldn't say that. That's not. I'm not saying that we haven't tried, but just by chance, my unit hasn't taken any prisoners. So I haven't interacted directly with any Russians. One thing I have seen is I've seen obviously the huge amount of drone footage, the drones that we've been using. I've actually physically seen the Russians when we've contacted them. And although I can't give you an analysis of the morale, what I can say is that they're getting the crap beaten out of them. I don't know if I can say that on here. You don't mind me swearing,
no,
but we've been hitting them hard, literally everywhere. There's nothing more joyous than throwing up a drone, utilizing our intelligence, whatever that intelligence might be, to locate a Russian team, and then to target it with artillery and watch them running from house to house, following them with the drone and constantly hitting them. These guys are running until they're exhausted. You can see from the drone broken men who are retreating from their positions. Well, that's not a confident and aggressive military that's winning a war. So yeah, I'd say their morale is pretty low.
When I watch these drone videos, they just look so ragged and dirty and not professional at all.
Yeah, well, I've come across the filth that's in their trenches. I've seen evidence of drug use. I've seen evidence of heavy alcohol use, presumably because they're left in such horrendous conditions. Yeah, I mean, that's one of their untidiness and uncleanliness and unprofessionalism is one of the reasons why they're dying in such high numbers. When we operate, they don't know we're there, and we obviously most obvious. I won't talk about them, but they're easily understandable and quite basic tactics, but. The difference between the quality of the Ukrainian soldiers and the Russians is absolutely vast. And it's, as I said, it's not the sign of a professional team. That's not to say that the Russians aren't dangerous, because one of the mistakes that you could make is that because it's such a vast front line and because there are hundreds of thousands of soldiers involved in this conflict, they're all the same. No, what I've discovered is that the front line generally is a vast amount of underfed, underpaid, under-equipped conscripts, but interspersed amongst them are some exceptional Russian units that are aggressive, incredibly aggressive, and have literally no mercy whatsoever, and have executed Ukrainians, not in my team, but in teams around us, and tortured them too. So that's one thing that people shouldn't take away from this call, is that Russia will be easy to beat over the next few months. They are still a ferocious enemy.
If you were capable of directly communicating with the Russian people, for the Russians who just don't want to be political, what would you like to tell them? These are Russians that aren't supporting the war, but they're also doing nothing to oppose it currently.
Well, I'd say to them, think of your future, because it clearly isn't working to appeal to their humanist side and the humanitarians amongst them and say, look, you're devastating Ukraine. There is clear evidence of widespread human rights abuses, of widespread criminal acts, including the murder and rape of civilians. That is for several reasons. One, the propaganda outfits and the repression within Russia itself are so strong. But also because of years of that repression, it's made them indifferent to other people's suffering, it seems. So I would simply make the case to them that they should think more about their own future, because their own future is one that is utterly bleak, totally isolated, and one that is not fit for their children. The Russian economy has been devastated by these sanctions. It is running on adrenaline pretty much at the moment and on suffering. It is not a long-term, it's not something they can maintain for a very long time. Russian people are isolated diplomatically and personally from the West. Their children will struggle to go to Western universities. They'll struggle to travel internationally. Their reputation internationally has taken absolute hits. So unless they want to become a satellite state of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist Party, if they really want to aspire to create a Western-orientated Russia, one that engages with the world, one that has a strong economy that is not just based on oligarchs stealing fossil fuels and abusing the system, but instead one that's open and transparent, then what they should really be doing is embracing Ukraine and actually saying, you and I actually have suffered from the same problems in the past because of oligarchs, because of our shared dark history. And actually, we apologize for the terrible things that have happened to you. And instead, we like you, would like a future where we engage with the world and we make the best of everything that we've got in our country. Because at the moment, the path that Russia is going down is dark and destructive. And if they really knew that the direction they were going, because of the madness and the selfishness of one man, Vladimir Putin, their dictator, then I think that would drive them to the streets. Because do it for their own children. If you're not willing to do it for Ukrainian children, do it for your own children, is what I'm trying to say.
For Russian men who do not want to be conscripted or mobilized, do you think they should be given protected status and allowed refuge in Western countries? Do you think, the two camps is let them out, prevent them from being put into the Russian military, or keep them in Russia, they need to stay there?
I would say that anyone, male or female, that wants to leave Russia because they don't agree with Russian politics and they are afraid for their children, the safety of their children in Putin's Russia, I think they should be allowed to come to the West. At the end of the day, this is not Russia's war, it's Putin's war. I do think that a lot of people are angry with the Russians because they feel like they haven't supported Ukraine, and that unfortunately Putin does still have, but then again this is inflated because of his control of the media. He still does have strong opinion polls, ratings and opinion polls in Russia. So, but yeah, no, to answer your question directly, I do think they probably should be allowed into the West. If anything, as you say, to deprive Russia and Putin of the first the bodies to throw at this war, but also, as you say, the economic benefit of these people, because typically the people who will leave are the ones that can leave. These are the educated classes and all the rest of it. You almost feel sorry for the incredibly poor and the vulnerable who actually are forced to stay in Putin's Russia, and those are increasingly are becoming the target of Russian conscription, i.e. The prison system and everything else. So if I was in Putin's Russia, I'd consider leaving as well.
But then the question is, who lets them in? Where do they go?
You'd hope it'll be across a number of countries, and obviously they're not coming in vast numbers, and it would only be a temporary solution because I think so. Because one of the big mistakes that we've made in the past, and this is actually a controversial opinion, I'll take Syria for example. Germany took in 1 million Syrian refugees over the course of the war there. And millions more went to places like Sweden and to Britain and to France and all the rest of it. And it was devastating for the Syrian country, because I do understand why people left, and they're absolutely right to leave, and they're absolutely right to be offered shelter and all the rest of it. But for them to then claim citizenship and then to stay in those countries is not something I really think is the most appropriate, primarily because I think they should be returning to their country to help rebuild their country. Because when I was in Syria, I saw entire communities devastated by war and then hollowed out, and deserted villages. There were ghost towns in Syria. And what Syria needed more than anything, particularly now because ISIS has been degraded and destroyed to, they haven't been completely annihilated, but they are repressed now, and they're just another terrorist group in the Middle East. What Syria needs now is life. It needs young people that believe in Syria to return there and to rebuild and to hope for a better future. If Russians were to leave in large numbers from Russia because they are too scared to fight the Putin regime, they don't want anything to do with the Putin regime, then they should be allowed to come, as far as I'm concerned. And then they should return home at an appropriate date in the future. I do agree that we should cut off Russia, and this may seem like a contradiction, but bear with me. I truly believe that we should be going, America, Britain, the West generally, should be going a lot further in diplomatically isolating Russia. Russia should be turned into the next North Korea, because what effectively that does is it means that Russians themselves, if they're not allowed to go on holiday in Western countries, they're not allowed to receive any financing, they're not allowed to buy any goods from the West and everything else, then they will feel that they are trapped in a vast prison, essentially. And those that wish to leave that prison, particularly in the early days, maybe there should be a window in the early days for good people to be allowed out, because you don't want to force people out. And have a cut-off period whereby on this date we are going to completely close the borders with Russia, and there will be no flights. No one will ever be able to fly between London and Moscow. No Russian citizen will be allowed to have a tourist visa to London, to Paris, to Rome, to Washington, to New York, and you say goodbye to any Western education and Western produce. And if we were to have the strength to do that, I think the hopelessness of their position will become even more apparent. So, hopefully those don't seem like two contradictory positions, but I haven't thought about this much. But I would hope that the good in Russia and those wishing to get out while they still can should be allowed. But the evil in Russia that we need to contain and all the rest of it should be dealt with in a more strict way than we're currently doing.
I see these pictures online of the wives of, defense ministers vacationing in Paris or New York City on luxury shopping trips, and while their husbands are waging war in Europe, their wives are, but it's the money. The reason why they're not blocking their visas and not keeping them inside of Russia is because they want them to come to these big cities, spend their money, pay taxes, stimulate the local economy. And I do see the argument there that we're taking their money, it's going to the West. But at the same time, what incentive does that woman have to put pressure on her husband to maybe, challenge the government, stop the war, when she can still live a life of luxury and comfort visiting Western cities?
Yeah, it's just unfair. It's ridiculous. And I think that the trouble with the West and the trouble with Western politicians is they are very, immediate. They don't really think of the long-term future. They're always looking to the next election, essentially, which is one of the flaws in democracy itself, because having long-term vision is very difficult when if you're a lame duck president, or you've only got one term left or whatever. that's why that they are not willing to take a short-term hit. They have actually proved themselves to take a short-term hit in the sense that with the sanctions that have been introduced so far have done a lot of damage to the Russian state, and they've also been damaging for the West as well. But the West has come together and said, okay, we're willing to take these on the chin to hit Russia. I'm just saying, go a bit further, because at the end of the day, it's better to go all in and really devastate the Russian economy and really isolate the Russian people and end this war sooner than actually go half in and hurt them and hurt yourself and all the rest of it and not really target them, and the war drags on for that little bit longer, because there will be a time, hopefully, that the things will change, that peace will come, and that Russia may even return to the international community. And when it does, that's when you can start skimming and creaming off from the oligarchs again, if that's what you want to do, West. But for now, take it on the chin and go all in, because it'll be better for you and it'll be better for Ukraine, more importantly, if you did that.
Do you think the level of military assistance being provided to the West to Ukraine is enough in order for Ukraine to retake all of its territories?
I think it's just been a shame that Western weaponry has been bled out of the West, and it hasn't come so freely and so quickly. Tanks, for example, could have been given months ago, and we could have actually already deployed tanks on the front line. And also there could be more tanks in greater numbers as well being offered to Ukraine. I do think, though, that, and I do think the West is terribly mistaken in thinking that by providing weapons that they will somehow aggravate the war and extend the war and cause more violence and all the rest of it, which is absolutely absurd. What's absurd is allowing Russia to win and actually allowing more of Ukraine to be devastated and more massacres to take place. So we have to say to ourselves, right, what is the end goal here? Do we want Ukraine to win? If the answer to that question is yes, then nothing should be off the table. We need to make sure that Ukraine wins and wins now, because that's how you end a war quickly. Instead, what we've had is as I said, we bled weapons out of the West, whereby Ukraine has almost had to prove itself to the West and prove itself to the US and sort of say, by giving this to us, we're able to achieve this. Give us more, we'll achieve this, sort of thing. And it's this sort of target-based allocation of weapons has been slow, and it has cost lives, and it has extended the war as far as I'm concerned. But at least it's coming. And at least these weapons are landing in the hands of a motivated and passionate fighting force. Because if I'm honest, of all the weapons in the arsenals of Ukraine and in the West, it is the passion and the determination of the Ukraine that is the secret weapon. Without that, all the glitzy weapons in the world just do not work. And actually, some of that is exemplified by Russia itself, who has spent billions on sophisticated weaponry, some weaponry, a lot of their weaponry is crap, but so the weapons they do have, the best of the weapons, is often placed in hands of conscript soldiers that didn't even know they were deploying on a military operation prior to the start of the war. So, yeah, I think more needs to come, basically, from the West.
What do you think Ukraine needs more of or the most right now?
I think well, I'd say four things, really. I'd say it would be nice to see aircraft to provide bombing strikes on the front line and to attack Russian positions, but also to defend the coming offensive. If that's not forthcoming, because obviously it'll take a bit of time to train people on Western weaponry, but if we don't have enough Soviet weaponry to provide to them, then the least that we need to be providing them is sophisticated air defense systems that really will stop Russia from having complete control of the skies when the forthcoming operation comes. And then the next two things, or two and a half things, is tanks and artillery. With tanks, we can smash through the front line, and we can actually, with a combined arms attack, actually make the progress that needs to be made, obviously alongside the next thing, which will be artillery. And the half is obviously extra shells. We obviously, we need to keep firing those weapons. So more of the big stuff is really needed, because there's no shortage really of small arms. There's no shortage of soldiers willing to volunteer to fight for their country. There's no shortage of morale. There's no shortage of food and everything else, because the people of Ukraine have rallied, and the West has rallied and is supporting even civil institutions, and even civilians are supporting Ukraine in many different ways. I know you've raised yourself thousands of dollars for the cause. So clearly the goodwill of the West is going to help Ukraine in many different ways, but the goodwill of the West will only go so far without military and without government support. So that government support has to manifest itself in better weaponry, basically. And then let the Ukrainians do the rest. As Churchill said, give us the tools and we'll do the job.
So for those at home that want to be doing more, what can they be doing to help Ukraine from their home countries? What recommendations do you have for them?
Well, if you do want to help Ukraine and you're just an ordinary guy, you've got or girl, and you've got an ordinary job and all the rest of it, I think you can do many different things. One is the information space. I've been blown away by this the NAFO phenomenon that's been going around Twitter. At first, I didn't really get it. And I didn't know what to think of it. And then I realized, then one day I can remember going on the Russian government's website, and they were giving out the usual propaganda, and underneath there was this swarm of ordinary folk from all around the world, these NAFO people, correcting them, saying that's bullshit, that's wrong, that's a lie. And then I realized that actually wherever Russia went, and one of the tools in the Russian arsenal is disinformation, is propaganda. Wherever they went, NAFO and the online communities that support Ukraine were absolutely pummeling them wherever they went, and they were just sort of swatting them away, thinking to themselves, there's no real rebuttal to this, because in Russia we repress, but in the free and Twitter and Western media, there's nothing we can do to stop these people. So if you do want to support, if you are on social media, show your support. Tweet your support. Correct Russian disinformation wherever you see it. That's obviously the least you can do. That's something worthwhile, because obviously if we all work together doing that, individually we're small and we're mosquitoes, but in the big scheme of things, we're a swarm of mosquitoes, and we'll bite the hell out of them. But the next thing you can do is you can donate your own money. And that can be as little as much as you like, because again, a little goes a long way, particularly for some of these amazing charities that provide food to the needy, weapons to the military, etc., etc. You can also work within your community, work with your church. I do know near where I live, there's a Ukrainian church. In the early days of the war, I went to go see them before I went back to join the army and stuff. And this church was packed with boxes full of diapers and baby formula and everything you could possibly imagine, clothes and all the rest of it. And it was all being packed into lorries and shipped off to Ukraine. Again, mobilizing your community. And community is not just geographic. It could be your church, or it could be your school or your university and all the rest of it. Harnessing their energy and directing it towards the Ukrainians, again, is a force multiplier, and it's a way for people who might not have a huge amount of cash to actually really donate some serious stuff, serious money to Ukraine. And then, man, if you just did those things, donate a bit of your time online, donate a little bit of your money if you can, or to work with other people to donate their money, then that alone is a great thing. If you've got a particular skill set, you're a nurse or a doctor, a trauma surgeon, or whatever, or you work as in construction or whatever, and you wish to go out to Ukraine and actually spend a month with a charitable organization, you can go online and find these people and go out and actually get your hands dirty away from the front line. If you're a former service person, you don't just have to go off and fight. There are places you can go and train, where you can train people. So there's plenty of things you can do. And if you find time to do any of those things, then I take my hat off to you, because you're doing more than most, basically.
Are there any specific charities or organizations you'd like to shout out to right now?
Well, I particularly love one which is Come Back Alive, which I'm sure you'll be able to find them. All you gotta do is type in Come Back Alive into Google. I'm sure it'll come up. A
I'll link
Ukrainian
it down
charity that's
below.
been that would be good. A great charity. It's been around for a while. They've been providing personal protective equipment to the front line and medical support and all the rest of it. There's also aid organisations directly tied to the Ukrainian government. So those are the ones I always do the biggest shout out to. There are numerous others, some based in the US and some based in Britain and all the rest of it. But to keep things simple, I always just say find a really good Ukrainian charity like Come Back Alive and then support it. And you can't go wrong.
For anyone watching this video who has had the thought of going to Ukraine to volunteer for the military or join the Foreign Legion, what advice or message would you like to share with them?
I would say, well, good on you. Anyone who wants to volunteer, I respect that. I wouldn't presume to really lecture anyone. Certainly, for, let's say, former service people, all I can do is advise. So I wouldn't want to discourage or encourage. That's what I'm trying to say there. I'm reluctant to say, or I should say really, that you should think very carefully before going, and you do have to think about your personal relationships back home. Can you afford the time to go out to these places? And then, if I were to go out, if the worst happened to me, would it only impact me or would it impact someone else? I've seen close friends of mine die and leave behind small children and all the rest of it, and it's been difficult on them. So to be mindful of that. But of course, this is obviously stating the obvious. The front line is absolutely horrendous. It's nothing that I've ever experienced before, and I've experienced some horrendous combat myself in Syria, where in Syria we were two forces that were similar in size and similar in equipment, fighting it out in horrendous places like Raqqa and Mosul and Manbij and other places. Something like in 3 years, 12,000 Kurds died. 50 or 60 foreigners have died in the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria. In some of the engagements, we had casualty rates of like 10%, 20% dead in every time we went out to fight. So death was, and misery and hardship was our bread and butter there. But in Ukraine, it's been turbocharged. It's what's the worst thing really is the amount of artillery that there is, which there's little defense against, because there's nothing worse than obviously there's a difference between going out on a patrol and engaging the enemy at a distance and all the rest of it, and also going out and then just with no cover coming under severe and intense grad fire and artillery fire, which it rattles your cage, it rattles the brain from the lining of your skull. It's and it will, and it can turn you into. I've seen people basically cry out. Basically, we had one guy who we actually had to remove from the team because he wanted to surrender when they came under not artillery but a huge amount of grenade fire. So it's a very different war to anything that we've seen for a very long time. I think it's much closer to the First World War in its horrendous conditions. You're literally walking past bits of people when you go to the front line. And the vast majority of the people who are dying, actually, where I was operating, is by artillery and by drone bombs.
Let me actually ask a question about Syria. Do the SDF forces, I don't know enough, but does SDF oppose Bashar al-Assad?
It does. So the SDF was formed over time. So when I joined in 2014, there was a group called the YPG, which is the Kurdish People's Protection Units, and they were defending themselves against ISIS that was growing. Obviously, in 2014, it burst onto the world stage. They took Mosul, second largest city in Iraq. They took, obviously, Raqqa the year before that, and they were devastating the region. And people were wondering where they going to go next? Were they going to Turkey, Jordan? Were they going to get into? Were they going to attack Israel, Lebanon? So the crisis was spiraling out of control, and the Americans had left in 2011. There was no huge desire to send troops back into Iraq, certainly not into Syria. So the response of the US was slow in the early days. In fact, it took 100 days between the fall of Mosul and the first American airstrikes in support of Iraqi and Peshmerga troops in Iraq. So in that 100 days, ISIS grew enormously. They devastated a huge amount of communities, and thousands and thousands of people died. It's in Syria. Obviously, the Kurdish People's Protection Units rose up. They believe in a thing called democratic confederalism. They have their own unique history. In shorthand, it really is, they believe in democracy and secular values, progressive values. They're very keen on things like feminism and all the rest of it. They're very left-wing. There's a lot of left-wing people, a lot of anarchists and communist internationals went out to join them. I didn't go for any political reason. I simply went as a humanist to support them because they had their backs against the wall as they were fighting ISIS. The Americans began to support them, but they also said to them, look, you're called the Kurdish People's Protection Units. If you are going to start taking back land, and if you are going to work with other groups, you need to start creating a brand, a group that actually incorporates more of the diversity of the country. And they chose the Syrian Democratic Forces as a way to differentiate themselves, not only from ISIS, obviously, but also from Assad as well. And I genuinely thought for many years that the SDF was a symbol of what could happen in Syria, because Syria was a country ripped apart by civil war. We had Assad, the brutal dictator, but you also had the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, that was corrupted by jihadism, and there was a huge growths in groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and ISIS. That there had to be another way, a third way. And the SDF, as far as I was concerned, and I still believe this, was that way. And America was supporting them. And guess what? When you put the SDF, passionate people who believe in democracy and who want to fight for their homes, you put it with the best of America, airstrikes and qualified good American special service, what's the word? My mind's gone blank. Exceptional elite soldiers. And going on the offensive, they absolutely annihilated ISIS. And over the years, I fought in Raqqa, I fought in, as I said, Manbij, Shadadi, and many other places. And I was a witness to history. I saw ISIS crumble, the ISIS so-called caliphate crumble, and I saw it replaced with something a lot better. I think they were betrayed by Trump, who then asked for US troops to withdraw from Syria. And I've got a vision for America. I'm a huge fan of America. I love America a lot. But I have a particular view on American politics and American foreign policy, which I can share with you, I suppose, but which means that America really, one of its greatest strengths is engaging with the world. As countries like China rise and grow economically, if America is to remain the superpower of the world, remain in a privileged position on the world stage, then it can't just fight, it can't withdraw in on itself. It's not just about money and brass tacks, which so many, particularly Republican members of Congress, seem to always come down to. America also relies on its values and its soft power to get its message out into the world, and that message can be exceptionally good for the world as well if America were to focus on it. And in Syria, you saw a good example of great American foreign policy. And what you saw in Trump withdrawing troops and talking about America first was the very worst of American foreign policy, because America then just closes in on itself. It doesn't engage with the world. It undermines its friendships with strong allies like Canada and Britain. So
I think more and more, both political parties are isolationists now. There's no appetite or
Disaster.
interest for in either party to militarily engage with the world. Soft power is great, diplomacy is great, but as far as the Bush era, the national security hawks, they're gone. Everyone hates them. They're excommunicado in Washington D.C. People like John Bolton and Condoleezza Rice, and so yeah, it's probably going to be decades before the United States ever gets involved in another war outside of the Americas. I just don't think it's going to happen in the near term.
Well,
I want to follow up real quick with, you said that Syrian refugees should go back to Syria eventually. Do you think it's safe for them to do that while Assad remains in power?
I think there are areas of Syria that are safe. So, for example, a key place is the areas controlled by the Kurds, for example. I drove through communities that, although obviously near the front line in the ISIS-controlled areas, they were devastated, and they're being rebuilt now by the Kurds and by the West, by the Americans, who are still involved, thankfully. There are areas of Syria that are relatively peaceful when you compare it to the rest of the country. Syria is still a divided country. It's still a country blighted by problems. But again, going back to the point that I was making there, is that by going back to their country, going to the areas that are safe for them to exist and for them to rebuild and to invest in the economy, it shows another way for the society. And obviously multiple things have to happen before Syria, the wounds of Syria heal. One of them obviously is on the diplomatic level, whereby we need to talk to Assad and we need to talk to the people who have a stake in this game. But one of the ways that we would actually get extra bargaining chips at the negotiation table and all the rest of it is actually showing Syria and Assad and everyone else exactly what vision we have for Syria, and actually creating in Syria something that is democratic, is progressive, and has women's rights and gay rights and all the rest of it centre stage, or at least enshrined within their constitution. Then that is the third way. Basically, and I do believe in democracy. I do believe that people want to live, obviously, in peaceful societies, societies that are at ease and that have a vision for the future. And and it's up to the West, particularly in places like Syria and also in places like Ukraine, to nurture that democracy and nurture it and support it. And that's how we can grow American power. It doesn't have to be American boots on the ground.
I agree with everything you say, but do you expect Assad to remain in power? Do you feel like he has to be removed eventually?
I think if we'd created the conditions whereby it was impossible for Assad to stay in power, then he would have left voluntarily. Obviously, Assad will do what's right for the Assad family. That's what Assad wants to do. He wants to make sure his children don't end up hanging from lampposts, which is more than possible if they were taken over by, let's say, al-Nusra or whatever. So Assad was under threat, and when the protests first rose up in 2011, after the sort of Arab Spring, and he did what all dictators do. He pulled out the guns and began shooting people. He then provoked a dreadful civil war, which he couldn't quite see the end of the civil war, and he couldn't see what would come next. There was no way he would ever agree. If America had sported as I said, a third way, if we had drawn a line in the sand and sort of said, right, do you believe in freedom? Do you believe in democracy and equality and all those other values that we believe in the West? Okay, you do. You cross that line, we support you. And actually, I'm sure Assad... and if the SDF had continued to grow, defeated ISIS, maybe had started to merge with elements of the FSA that were sympathetic, if the parts of the FSA didn't support the SDF, they should have been attacked and destroyed, because the vast majority of the FSA that doesn't agree with the Kurds are mostly sort of al-Nusra and the al-Qaeda terrorist groups anyway, and should be destroyed by the West. And you need to find what unites people more than what divides them. And in Syria, what united people across the spectrum, from Assad to people who believe in democracy, was the horrendousness of groups like ISIS. And if we should have said is, okay, we will never, because of Russian intervention, because of Assad's fear of the future, we'll never perhaps be able to completely topple him. But what we can do is bring him to the negotiating table and come up with a strategy that might create the long-term conditions for not only peace but democracy at some point in the future. Does that mean that Assad gets to stay as president for a period of time? Does it mean that there's a rotating presidency between communities? Is there a way that we can forgive him for his crimes and allow him to go abroad with billions of dollars and live out his life on a luxury yacht? Whatever those conditions are, there had to be a way. But to get to the place where these things are even conceivable, you had to support the opposition. You couldn't allow yourself to be divided and all the rest of it, because that's where ISIS and dictatorships and fascism thrive, is where people are divided.
I'm just thinking out loud here, but do you see a connection between the war in Ukraine and Syria, in that if Russia can be militarily defeated enough to weaken the Putin regime, perhaps this triggers some kind of revolution in Russia, that might dry up support for Assad in Syria, which would weaken him, allowing for maybe greater reforms? I'm just thinking out loud, but is there a connection there that you see?
Well, that's entirely conceivable. Assad draws a great deal of his power and his military strength from the Russian Federation. It was the intervention of the Russians that saved Damascus and potentially saved his life in the early, way back in 2015-16, whenever the Russians intervened in the conflict, because they were bearing down on Damascus. And then Russia completely reversed that by then providing them with arms, providing them with qualified Russian pilots and the weaponry to start going on the offensive again. And they hit them in places like Aleppo, finally taking it back. And it was only the intervention of Turkey on behalf of the FSA that now you've got more of a stalemate. You've got Turkey back in the FSA in one part of the country. You've got Assad being backed by the Russians in Damascus and in the south. But in the other part of the country, you've got the Kurds being backed by the Americans. Although the Americans let the Kurds down and they allowed Russia to seize a lot of ground in Syria by threatening to withdraw troops, because then the Kurds, the first thing they did was that, because they were compelled to, they turned straight to Assad and to Russia and said, help us, because if the Americans leave, then Turkey and the FSA will invade. And the FSA, half of them are former ISIS members. They will decapitate our children, and all kinds of horrendous human rights abuses are going to take place. They've already attacked places like Afrin, which was a Kurdish majority area. More than 300,000 Kurds have been forcibly displaced from that region, and Arab supporters of Turkey and the FSA have been put into their homes. So they've completely been replaced, ethnically replaced. And that's what they feared in the rest of their communities. And that's exactly what actually Erdogan threatened. Erdogan actually said that what we're going to do is we're going to take 100 miles of territory between the Turkish border and Syria, and we're going to make that a so-called safe zone where we're going to resettle people from other parts of the country. What the Kurds really realized there was they were going to displace the Kurds and they're going to force Arabs to live there, and that means that the Turks don't have a Kurdish problem anymore on their border. So again, the withdrawal of the Americans became an issue of life and death for the Kurds. So they were compelled to reach out to the Russians, which increased Russian power. If America had doubled down and actually used the Kurds to expand their territory in Syria and push back against terrorist groups and all the rest of it, which they were doing incredibly successfully up until that point, and still doing to some degree, then we might be in a much better position. But now we're in this stalemate where we've got three main parties there staring at each other from across the table. And because America isn't stepping up and really coming down hard on the participants, then we're not going to see peace anytime soon. But if Russia were to fall, Assad's position would be compromised, primarily because you might think that if Russia had a regime change, the first people that would go on the offensive most likely is actually going to be Turkey and the FSA. The FSA would probably go, a new civil war would probably break out in Syria. And
so I'm detecting you're not a big fan of Erdogan.
I'm not at all. No. Well, I'm not a fan of dictatorship. I'm not a fan of
Yeah.
autocracy. I'm not a fan of nepotism and everything else. And that's exactly what Erdogan's regime represents.
There's
Erdogan
something
really
wrong with him.
models.
He's sick. He had a
Well,
stroke on camera.
oh, I haven't
There's
seen
something.
that. I need to. Well, that would be amusing to watch if
Well,
not
he
informative.
fainted in an interview, and they wouldn't show the video of him fainting, but they showed the video of the reporter watching him faint. And
Mm.
I guess there's an election in Turkey coming up, and people are questioning if he's physically fit.
Mm.
I
Well,
don't know.
he's modelled himself on Putin, by the way. So Erdogan is, as far as I'm concerned, they are the weak link in the NATO armour, but primarily because if you there's I think it's Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, great book, obviously compelled reading for anyone who does IR, international relations. If you look at Turkey, in his opinion. They almost have to break from the secular world. They almost have to break from the West if they are to recreate the Ottoman Empire. They are actually going to, they have visions in that direction. And that's exactly where I see Erdogan going. I think Erdogan genuinely, like Putin, regrets the fall of the Ottoman Empire as Putin regrets the fall of the Soviet Union. I genuinely think that he's a Turkish nationalist and a Islamist that wishes to expand Turkish power at the expense of his neighbours. He's already proved that in Syria and other places, in Armenia. I genuinely think that short-termism in the West, i.e. economics, a fear that Turkey would fall into the hands of Russia and China and all the rest of it, has meant that we're turning a blind eye to the worst successes of the Erdogan regime. But the chickens will come home to roost. We will have to we are making our bed and we will lie in it eventually. And that's the frustrating thing with the West, is they don't see these problems before they become problems.
Well, we've gone well over an hour, so let's try and go back to the war in Ukraine. And I want to ask you, how has your opinions, values changed after spending time in the war zone in Ukraine, almost a year? You already had lots of experience from past war zones and conflicts. How has the war in Ukraine changed your thinking?
It's it's made me more passionate about Ukraine. I believe in Ukraine. I believe it's a wonderful country with a proud history and a wonderful culture. I think that culture and that history has been repressed by Russia. I think there is profound ignorance in the West and in my own country about Ukraine. To be cheap and what's the word? Basic. Many people in Britain, a few short years ago, their only opinion of Ukraine might be, mail order brides, communist bloc, they associate it with negative things. They barely had any knowledge of Ukraine as a country. What they don't realise is Ukraine is the gateway to Europe. It has huge, strong connections historically to almost every single European nation, including Britain. Harold Hardrada, the Viking that attempted to invade Britain in 1066, just before the conqueror came, who was defeated. Harold Hardrada was defeated at Stamford Bridge, I think. His wife was Ukrainian. She's buried in Kiev. I went to her grave. The genetic links between and the strong, the culture and the history of Ukraine actually really is firmly based in particularly Northern Europe and stuff. And these are things that I had no idea about. It's fascinating to learn about. And also, it's a country that is vastly wealthy as well. It's the largest country in Europe. It's got a dynamic and intelligent and passionate young people, workforce. They've got a huge amount of resources, vast farms and all the rest of it. Still reasonably good infrastructure that needs to be invested in. But either way, this is a country that can become a strong ally economically, culturally, politically, of the West, of Europe and of America. And that's one of the reasons why I support them. So if it's changed me at all in my time there, it's made me more passionate about Ukraine as well. I love the country and I wish them the very best. And that's why I'm willing to fight for them.
Is there any questions you had for me or anything you wanted to ask me?
Not really. I suppose I'm interested a little bit about, because obviously I know that you've raised thousands of dollars for my unit, because you've you actually sent $1,000 yourself, although you should have got that back by now, actually, by the way, because we had to
It
refund
was
people.
returned and then I sent it again.
Oh, did you? Did it get through? I don't know. I need to check if it went by PayPal or it went a different route. I don't know. But
It was returned. This was months ago, and then it was returned. But the new PayPal account, it was your friend, the woman.
Yes, Mindy. Great.
Yeah, I sent it to Mindy.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's great.
But yeah, I've taken on. I'm wary in my videos asking for donations or money or recommending charities because it never ends then. Like, I get people asking me all the time, hey, can you mention this? Hey, can you promote this? I can't say yes to everything. And it's difficult saying yes and no to certain things. I pop in when I can. I sharing on the community tab of my YouTube channel or on Twitter is free. I'll always do that. But as far as like personal funds, recently I took on channel sponsorships the last couple months, and I mean I've given a lot of my own personal money, but I like these micro transactions. People saying my unit needs this for this, and I like just tossing like $1,000 at it. I've given money to United 24, but it doesn't have the same feeling. It just kind of feels like it disappears, but when there's a unit saying, hey, we're trying to raise $3,000 for this, and I'm like, well, that's easy. Let's get this done. So that has a greater feeling. So originally I had like an Excel spreadsheet trying to keep track of everything I was doing, but now I don't really pay attention to it. Like financially, I've been blessed. I'm doing very well on YouTube, and as long as this conflict is going on, if I can help, I want to help.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, that's what because I've watched your YouTube show before. Then people were saying, because you shared some of my 2-minute videos, which you mentioned before, which blew me away, by the way, because that's one of the things that has been amazing, has been the amount of followers that I've got over the last few months, over the last 6 months. Like I've got like 134,000 people now, and they are not just people who are vaguely interested. There are thousands of people who are genuinely passionate, genuinely interested. That's where the whole NAFO thing comes in. And that does two things. One is there's so much goodwill towards me, which is so uplifting and wonderful and touching. Also, it's meant that my unit has never wanted for anything, because we just simply put a poster up and say, hey guys, we need to buy this and this and this. And then people have come together and rallied and really helped us make sure we got that stuff, which again, that's where you've come in and helped so much as well. So I mean, well, I'm going back in June. I'm going to buy, although I'm going to talk to a friend of mine, I'm going to try and get the car for free if I can, and I'm going to stuff that car with kit. So I'll try and get a postage address. So if people don't want to donate any money, they can still, if they've got, or if they want to buy a certain thing and they want to actually physically buy it and then hand it over so they can physically see something going to Ukraine, that'll be an option as well. But I'll be filling this vehicle up and going back in the summer. So,
well, if ever you're doing another fundraiser, let me know, Macer. Send me the link. I will blast it to my 350,000 subscribers. So we'll do everything we can to help. Are there any closing thoughts you wanna share?
No, I think stay passionate. Keep following those that are people like yourself, people like me, who are sharing their perspective of the conflict. So help you educate yourself on the conflict. Keep supporting Ukraine if you are. If you're not, consider supporting Ukraine. And let's hope this war comes to an end soon. I genuinely believe that it could do. I genuinely believe that the Ukrainians have the advantage now, not just on the battlefield, but also in spirit and heart. And hopefully this summer we'll see some big movements. So stay tuned. I think good things are coming.
I absolutely agree. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Thank you, everyone, for watching. If you're on Twitter, you can follow Macer yourself. If you want to support him, I think he has a Buy Me a Coffee page, and it's well as you can order his book and read about his time fighting ISIS. Thank you again, Macer, for your time.
Cheers. Anytime. Thank you.